You know what's wild? A single pound of black pepper in medieval Europe could buy you a house. Not rent one, buy one. And people were literally dying to get their hands on cinnamon. Today, we dump these spices into our lattes and pumpkin pies without a second thought. But 700 years ago, they were worth more than gold, sparked wars, and completely reshaped the world as we know it. So buckle up, because the history of medieval spices is way more intense than you'd think. I'm talking monopolies, myths, and murder. Let's dive in. Okay. First question, why were medieval people obsessed with spices? There's this popular myth that Europeans needed spices to cover up the taste of rotting meat. But here's the thing, that's completely false. If you could afford expensive spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. Rich people weren't eating spoiled food, trust me. The real reasons were way more interesting. First, spices were a status symbol. Imagine showing up to a feast and the host serves you a dish loaded with saffron, cloves, and ginger. That's them basically saying, yeah, I'm rich enough to cook with ingredients worth their weight in silver. It was medieval flexing at its finest. Second, medieval medicine was obsessed with spices. Doctors believed they could balance your bodily humors, cure diseases, and even act as if whether or not they worked didn't really matter. People believed they did, and that drove demand through the roof. And third, they just tasted good. Medieval European food could be pretty bland, so spices added excitement and flavor to everything from meat to wine. But here's the kicker. These spices didn't grow anywhere in Europe. Every single peppercorn, every stick of cinnamon had to travel thousands of miles to reach European tables. And that's what made them so expensive. So where did these spices come from? Most of them originated in South and Southeast Asia, places like India, Sri Lanka, and the Molucca Islands, which were literally called the Spice Islands. That's where you'd find pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger growing. Now, getting these spices to Europe was a logistical nightmare. They'd travel along the famous spice routes, a network of sea lanes and overland paths that stretched from Asia through the Middle East and into Europe. Here's the thing that made spices so ridiculously expensive. The middlemen, so many middlemen. A bag of pepper might start with a farmer in Kerala, India. Then it would pass through the hands of local traders, then Arab merchants, then Venetian or Genoese traders, and finally reach a market in London or Paris. Each person along the way took their cut, marking up the price. By the time spices reached Europe, they'd been marked up by like 1,000% or more. We're talking about a 100 to -1 profit margin in some cases. And the merchants, they kept their sources secret. Arab traders would spread wild rumors about where spices came from to protect their monopoly. They'd tell Europeans that cinnamon was fished out of rivers guarded by deadly snakes, or that pepper grew in forests protected by poisonous serpents. Europeans had no idea where these spices actually came from, and the merchants wanted to keep it that way. Why? Because information was power, and controlling the spice trade meant controlling serious wealth. Speaking of those wild stories, let's talk about the absolutely bonkers myths medieval Europeans believed about spices. Since most people had never seen where spices grew, they relied on fantastical tales from travelers. And let me tell you, these tales were wild. People believed cinnamon came from giant bird nests. Seriously, the story went that massive birds called cinnamon birds built their nests on cliffs using cinnamon sticks. And brave hunters had to trick the birds into dropping the cinnamon. That was the official explanation. Pepper was thought to grow in forests in India guarded by serpents, and the only way to harvest it was to set the forest on fire to drive the snakes away. People thought this was why peppercorns were black, because they'd been scorched. Ginger was supposedly guarded by a tribe of one-eyed warriors called the Aramespians, and nutmeg, some believed it washed ashore on beaches, delivered by mysterious ocean currents from an unknown land. These stories weren't just entertaining. They served a purpose. They made spices seem even more exotic, rare, and valuable. And they helped merchants justify those insane prices. Now, we need to talk about the darker side of the spice trade, because it's not all just fun myths and fancy feasts. The demand for spices literally reshaped global politics and sparked some of the most brutal conflicts in history. Venice and Genoa, two Italian city-states, fought wars over control of Mediterranean spice routes. These weren't small skirmishes. We're talking major naval battles with thousands of casualties all over pepper and cinnamon. And then, in the 1400s, things got even more intense. European powers realized that if they could find a direct sea route to Asia, they could cut out all those middlemen and monopolize the spice trade themselves. This sparked the age of exploration. Christopher Columbus was literally trying to find a western route to the Spice Islands when he accidentally stumbled into the Americas. Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to reach India, and his voyage was funded entirely by Portugal's desire to control the spice trade. But here's where it gets really dark. When Europeans finally reached the Spice Islands, they didn't just trade peacefully. They conquered, colonized, and committed atrocities in the name of spicy. The Dutch East India Company took over the Moluccas and established a brutal monopoly on nutmeg and cloves. They destroyed spice trees on islands they didn't control to keep prices high. They massacred local populations who resisted. They even executed people for smuggling nutmeg seeds. The Portuguese and Spanish did the same in other regions. The spice trade directly fueled European colonialism, and its effects echoed for centuries. So yeah, when you sprinkle cinnamon on your oatmeal, you're using a spice that literally changed the course of history, and not always for the better. So, what happened? Why aren't spices worth their weight in gold anymore? Well, once Europeans figured out where spices came from and established direct trade routes, the mystery and the monopoly vanished. By the 1600s, the Dutch, Portuguese, and British had set up colonies and trading posts throughout Asia. Suddenly, spices were flowing into Europe in massive quantities. More supply meant lower prices. That pound of pepper that once cost as much as a house, now it was affordable for middle-class families. And then, in the 1700s and 1800s, European powers started transplanting spice plants to their colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and the Americas. Suddenly, you didn't even need to trade with Asia. You could grow your own cinnamon in Jamaica or your own cloves in Zanzibar. The spice trade, as medieval people knew it was over, spices became commonplace, everyday ingredients. But the impact, that lasted forever. The spice trade reshaped global economics, drove exploration, sparked wars, and connected continents in ways that still affect us today. So there you have it, the secret history of medieval spices. They weren't just about flavor, they were about power, wealth, mystery, and control. The next time you grab that little jar of cinnamon from your spice rack, remember, people crossed oceans, fought wars, and built empires for what you're about to casually sprinkle on your toast. History is weird like that, isn't it? The most ordinary things in our lives were once extraordinary, rare, and worth killing for. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the weird, wild, and wonderful past. Drop a comment and let me know what other everyday items have insane historical backstories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.